Welcome to St. Catharines, Ontario, Canada, home to an often untold piece of history. This is the Salem Chapel, where Harriet Tubman, known for her fearless work leading enslaved people in America to freedom across the Canadian border through the Underground Railroad, went to church during her time living in Canada. Harriet Tubman's connection to Canada, especially this very church, is a story many have never heard, but here in this historic landmark, her legacy lives on as a reminder of her courage, faith, and the fight for freedom. Hello, my name is Ivy Prosper, and today I'm in St. Catharines, Ontario, Canada, where I am outside of the church that Harriet Tubman attended. She was a very important figure here in the city of St. Catharines, where she helped people through the Underground Railroad to make their escape to freedom. And many people don't know that I actually grew up in the city of St. Catharines, born in Ghana, raised in this city. I did live in Toronto for a while, but this is the city where I spent my elementary school years and high school years. And I'm excited to come for this day tour today here at Salem Chapel.
My name is Rochelle Bush. I'm the trustee and resident historian of the Salem Chapel, British Methodist Episcopal Church, Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad National Historic Site in St. Catharines. It's important for people to know about Harriet Tubman because she's the most important iconic figure of the 19th century Underground Railroad movement. My connection to the Salem Chapel is that my two-times great-grandfather, Reverend James Henry Harper, was the minister in charge here for a period of time while Harriet Tubman attended the church. So on my maternal side, my mother's family arrived from South Columbia, South Carolina in 1837. So it was my great-great-grandfather, Reverend James Harper, who was the minister in charge. On my mother's maternal-paternal side, that family arrived from Tennessee. They settled in Fort Erie, made their way to St. Catharines. This is all in 1830, then moved out to Canfield. On my paternal side, so my father's branch arrived from Richmond, Virginia in 1830. They settled in Oro, Ontario. On my mother's side, they came from Virginia, Loudoun County in 1855. They settled in Toronto and then Hamilton. So that's my connection to the area as well as the province of Ontario. Downstairs, second volunteer of the church, another member, is Tracy Flowers. She is my third cousin, and the family that I said that came from Loudoun family, Virginia, that's our branch. So she's downstairs. And then they settled, eventually after Hamilton, settled in the Canfield area as well. So welcome to the Salem Chapel, British Methodist Episcopal Church, Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad National Historic Site. Disclaimers. So we've had some ongoing fundraising and restoration work. You won't see a lot of displays because the region announced at the end of April that they're going to put fiber optic cables on the opposite side of Geneva Street. That's supposed to happen this summer. We don't have all our displays out because if they smash, the region's not going to replace them. The light fixtures, they'll replace. The chimney, the outside stucco, but we received a vase, so it's not even a vase, a beer bottle, last year. And it was donated by a gentleman who was born and raised in St. Catharines. He now lives in Northern Ontario, but it belonged to a gentleman by the name of John Lindsay. Quick story about Lindsay. He was a trustee of the Salem Chapel. He was born and raised as a free black man in Washington, D.C. In 1834, he was captured and he was enslaved in Tennessee, and then he was sent to Louisiana. From Louisiana, he escaped, and he made his way here by 1836. He was destitute, he was broke, he had nothing. He was a very light-complected black man, and he said all he had to do to make his way to Canada was stay away from black people, because they would know who he was. So he made his way here, and he had nothing. 50 years later, when he died, he was the wealthiest black man, not only in St. Catharines, but Niagara region. The area that we're in now was called the Colored Village. But Lindsay was a tanner, he was also a blacksmith, he was a barber, and he owned a brewery. The bottle, he specialized in lemon beer. The bottle is from 1836 from his brewery. And of course, we do not want to part with that. Two-time narrative in Benjamin Drew's book, The North Side View of Slavery, that was published in 1856. Drew was a Boston abolitionist, and I'll talk more about him when we're downstairs. He captured Lindsay's narrative, and then Samuel Brigham Howe, during the Civil War, when he worked for the Freedmen's Inquiry Commission, he captured Lindsay's narrative again. And you can go online, and if you Google John Lindsay, you'll find a lot of his information. But to have that body donated to the church is just phenomenal. Lindsay died here in St. Catharines. He's buried out in Victoria Lawn Cemetery, and his gravestone will be restored by the end of September. Yes. So again, welcome to the Salem Chapel. The Salem Chapel is the third site in the city of St. Catharines. The first one was constructed around 1814 in the Queenston Street area. The property, we believe, belonged to Richard Pierpoint, who was the first person of African descent to settle in this area. And I'll get to that. So in 1824, when William Hamilton Merritt, Niagara's leading white male abolitionist, decided to develop the Welland Canal, the black community was relocated from that neighborhood over to here. So Welland Avenue, Geneva Street, and what William Wells Brown called the Broadway of the area, North Street. So we were here, we settled here. But going back to Richard Pierpoint. Richard Pierpoint, who's local? Raise your hand if you're local from St. Catharines. Okay, so everybody's familiar with the renaming of Centennial Park. So off of Gale Crescent and Oakdale Avenue, that's where part of Pierpoint's property was. He received 200 acres. So he was born in Senegal, captured African, enslaved in the British colonies, sold to a British officer. When the American Revolution broke out, he decided that he would fight for the British because the promise was you would receive your freedom after the war. So Pierpoint was stationed here in Niagara near the Fort George area. After the war, he received his 200 acres of land. He settled here in St. Catharines. He was the first black settler.
As she said, Richard Pierpoint was the first black settler in St. Catharines, Ontario, Canada. His story of being captured in Senegal, enslaved, and becoming free is one that I didn't know. So I wanted to share this clip from Heritage Minute, produced by Historica Canada, that shares some history about him that I thought you may also want to know.
When he was only 16, Richard Pierpoint was enslaved in Senegal and taken to America.
All us men have sworn on this petition to fight.
You're an old man. The British Army has militias and trained soldiers.
I fought with the British during the American Revolution.
Take your land and farm it. Leave the Americans to us.
With respect, sir. I was born a free man, and I intend to die one. Your officers fight for land and money. I fight for my freedom.
Richard Pierpoint was one of thousands of black loyalists who won their freedom in the American Revolution. 30 years later, at the age of 68, he petitioned for an all-black unit that would defend Upper Canada during the War of 1812.
So let's bear in mind, Pierpoint wasn't of North American descent. He wasn't born to enslavement in the United States. He wasn't born enslaved in the Caribbean or South America. He was a true son of Africa. He's the first person to have a public space named after him in Niagara, and that occurred 1 year ago next month. So, Pierpoint today is recognized as the most famous black loyalist in the country. And that's because the Canadian Embassy in Senegal is named after him. The federal building in London, Ontario, the RCMP building, is named after him. He's a person of national importance. He's a person of provincial importance. But what he did, which was so courageous, was in 1812, when he was 68 years old, when the US was invading Canada, they wanted to annex us, he decided he was going to raise a colored corps. So he went to General Brock and said, let's raise the colored corps. He was 68 years old, and this man picked up a gun just to defend his country, but more importantly, to defend his freedom. Because he told white and British officers, sir, you're just defending your livelihood, your house, how you're living, your property, your businesses. It's more important to us than that. We're defending ourselves from enslavement. Because when Pierpoint was here, and in 1812, People of African descent were enslaved. So Pierpoint, as a free black loyalist, was living next to black people who were enslaved. Everybody knows that Canada has held people of African descent as slaves, correct? Enslavement was here. The first person, we have three key figures of African descent who are prominent individuals. Pierpoint being one, Tubman being two, and we'll get to number three. So, when William Hamilton Merritt relocated the community over to this neighborhood, they decided that they had to build a church. So in the Queenston Street area, it was called the African Methodist Episcopal Society. They had a small chapel, people would worship outdoors, people would worship in their homes. Now it's 1835, we're over here, and according to John Jackson and Sheila Wilson, who wrote St. Catharines, the Canal City, they said the land was purchased in 1835, and they built a small chapel that housed about 70 people. We're going to fast forward, and that was where the police station is behind us now. We're going to fast forward to 1850. The U.S. government passes the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act. Is everybody familiar with that? Okay. So the Fugitive Slave Act meant that black people who had escaped from enslavement and were living in the northern states could now be captured and returned to slavery again. It also meant that free black people who were either born free or were manumitted by their enslaver could be captured or accused, right? That's all they needed was somebody to be accused. They would be abducted and sent into slavery for the first time in their lives. So, of course, that frightened many black folks. Thousands of people of African descent started to relocate to British Canada. So it was British North America at the time. Ontario was Canada West. It put white people up in arms. Because white people living in the northern states, for the most part, didn't have to worry about enslavement. Because it wasn't next door to them. So the black person that was living next to them for the past 20 years, what did they care if the person was a runaway or a free black person? Slavery was not in their backyard, so they didn't have to pay attention to it. Now the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act said they had to abide by federal laws. And if law enforcement, whether it be a U.S. Marshal or a slave catcher, needed their assistance, they had to help them apprehend the individual that was being accused of being a fugitive slave and help them with the arrest. Well, a lot of white people didn't want to do that. So overnight, it turned a lot of northern white people into anti-slavery sympathizers, activists, and abolitionists. So now the law changed. So after 1850, that's when thousands of people started relocating to British Canada. The congregation here decided that they needed another church because the one that was behind us was too small. It housed about 70 people. The congregation was growing. So they started fundraising for this church in October 1851, and they started building it in October 1853, so 2 years later, and the doors opened on November 4th, 1855. So this is the actual site. Not everything is original, as you can tell, but we'll get back to that. So, November 4th, 1855, the church opened. Well, let me do it right now. So, that plaque there commemorates the 1955-57 restoration project. So all this brown woodwork in here that you're seeing, this came in at that time. So the original, there's one of the original pews. Upstairs, the original pews. Some of the original plank boards, because we just had some replaced. Now, those are the original wrought iron rails for communion. That, of course, is the original pulpit. In God is our trust, the original stencils behind the brown woodwork. LACAC, which was a heritage committee, as well as Brock students who were in here in 1990. They went down to the original woodwork, they found the stencil, and they brought the stencil back to life. So that was actually here when Harriet Tubman was here. So some of our prized possessions, the Union Jack flag, of course. National Park Service and Parks Canada have been in here a few times, and they predate it to 1880. So yeah, one of our valued ones. In the back, we have one of our original offering plates that LACAC found in the attic. They think it's around 1855, one of the fans. So we have a few of those artifacts. They're not going to break if the region does any restoration work. So, November 4th, 1855, the church opened. It was dedicated by an African Methodist Episcopal bishop, Daniel Alexander Payne. And then 1 year later, we decided to sever our ties with the United States because of that 1850 Fugitive Slave Act. Nobody was willing to go to the United States to attend a conference because they could be captured under that 1850 Fugitive Slave Act and sent into slavery. So we became the British Methodist Episcopal Church, and that's how we received that title. Any questions about the Salem Chapel?
I have a question.
Sure.
Do you know why she chose to come to this church?
Absolutely. So why she came to this church, I would have got to that downstairs, but we'll do it now.
Okay.
Frederick Douglass and other black males had already set up an Underground Railroad. So the Underground Railroad, whether the timeline is correct or not, people think that it started in 1831 when a gentleman escaped from Kentucky, crossed the Ohio. His name was Tice Davis. So they believe his enslaver said that he disappeared on some underground road. So that's how many think that they got the name Underground Railroad. Others think it's because steam railroads were coming up at the time and they would use code words and passwords. But Frederick Douglass said in his 1881 biography, the Underground Railroad had many branches, but the one that he was connected to started in Baltimore, and I'm not going to do the whole thing because I'm going to do it downstairs. It had 8 stops, started in Baltimore and ended here in St. Catharines. And Tubman said the same thing in 1894 when she was being interviewed by Professor Wilbur Sieber. So that's the reason why it was the eastern line of the Underground Railroad. So 2 primary lines, eastern and western, which would be in Ohio, Kentucky, crossing at Detroit, Windsor, here. So the Detroit River, here, of course, the Niagara River. So now we have to talk about the mighty woman, Harriet Tubman. Doesn't get any better than that, and she's overtaken Frederick Douglass, who was the most photographed individual of the 19th century, more so than Abraham Lincoln, and more people listened to his lectures than anybody else, more so than Abraham Lincoln. So Tubman, as Frederick Douglass said, her work was done under the cover of darkness. She didn't receive the accolades or the applause. She didn't. So, born enslaved in Maryland around 1822, we'll never know her actual date of birth because we were no more important than the enslavers, coffee table, family dog, whatever. We were legalized property. So that's how black people were treated. So Harriet Tubman said in 2 Civil War depositions that she was born around 1825. Her contemporaries at the time said she was born about 1820 or 1821. Scholars today believe it was 1822. You're going to walk around the church, you're going to see plaques, you're going to see signs up, or things that we typed out. It's all going to say circa, because we don't know. And the minute we affirm she was born then we're wrong. We're doing her and our ancestors and the history a disservice. So this year, celebrating Harriet Tubman 200, which is possible, circa 200. That's simply how it is. Born enslaved, her name was Araminta Ross. So, by the time she was 4 years old, she states that she was so little that she already she was put out for labor, had to have a little baby that she would rock to sleep, placed in her crossed legs and arms. So she'd be seated, she'd have her legs crossed, this little baby she'd have in her arms, she'd rock it to sleep, while the master and mistress slept. If that child woke up, Harriet Tubman was getting her whipping. So the dynamics of slavery. 4 primary, separation of families. We're legal property. If I want to separate your family, I'm going to, and that's the way it is. The threat, Georgia. So if you lived in the upper south, the threat was you're going to be sold to the deep south. If you were Caribbean, if you were disobedient, you were going to Barbados. There was other threats, Jamaica, but Barbados was the primary. That's in a lot of British documentation as well. But in the United States, the threat was Georgia. So with Harriet Tubman, now she's about 9 years old. She's put out to labor again. Now she has to wade in the water, pulling muskrats out of traps. She becomes ill. She's sick with the measles. She's no good. They send her off to her mother to be, rehabilitated again, back to good health. So then there's an incident when she was little. She's at Miss Ellie's house. Miss Ellie, the name's escaping. Miss Susan's house, where she's supposed to be a weaver. Miss Susan and her husband are arguing. Harriet Tubman, their backs to her. She reaches for a cube of sugar. The mistress turns around and sees her. Harriet Tubman takes off. For 5 days, she's in a pig pen hiding because she knows what's coming. The number 3 dynamic of slavery, the whipping. So for 5 days, she's fighting a mother hog and the little piglets just for the food that's being put in the trough. And then she decides, I'm starving, so she returns. She receives her whipping. Miss Susan says she's no good as a laborer. Back to her mother she goes. So, number 1 dynamic, separation of families. Number 3, the whippings. We'll go to number 2 right now, which was the procreation of black women who were enslaved. I already told you about John Lindsay. All he had to do was stay away from black people. So, 1807, the British banned the slave trade. 1808, America has no recourse other than to ban the slave trade as well. So now we have to increase the slave population. Forced marriages that I can separate at any time. And you know what? I'll keep my white wife here in my family, and I will go down to the slave quarters and procreate with the females that I think are only subhuman and brute. And I will have these things that I consider my non-offsprings and treat them as slaves and sell them off, which we know happen. That's the problem with critical race theory because nobody wants to talk about that. When you go to, Dr. Walker's laughing, the best one is Dr. Henry Louis Gates' PBS documentary, African Americans, Many Rivers to Cross. Just listen to part 1 and listen to the numbers. It'll blow your mind. Because the rule then, or the talk then, was miscegenation. So there was a lot of talk about Thomas Jefferson and his mistress, Sally Hemings, and their offsprings, the kids. But if you want to fact check in real time right now, go to William and Ellen Craft. So just Google them. Ellen Craft was so white looking that that's how they escaped from enslavement. So her husband was dark complected. He passed as her servant. She was light complected. She tied gauze around her face, put her arm in a sling so that she couldn't write, she couldn't talk, and then they made their way to the north. And that's how they did it. She passed herself off as a man. All kinds. The last one I'll mention is Harper's Weekly from 1864. Just look at the front cover. Those people that look white were not white. They were enslaved black people. So has everybody seen the movie of the Solomon Northup, 12 Years a Slave? The movie was absolutely fantastic. The best Hollywood production out there yet, except one flaw. Everybody who was enslaved was dark complected. Make them, half of them look like you, and we got a movie. And that's how it was. If you read the narratives, half the people passing were white, like Frederick Douglass, Jermaine Logan. They were all either biracial or multiracial mixed. Why do I mention this? Forgotten cause of the Civil War. Professor Lawrence Tanzer wrote a book about it in 1998, and that's what was also leading up to the Civil War. Why? Because Southerners and Confederates gave enslaved black people who were white looking, the rule was 1 drop of black blood. So first let me go to that. Cut a pot in half, cut it in quarters, cut it in 16ths, 32nds, 64ths. You can look completely European, but as long as you identified one ancestor as black, you were black. That's how they could legally enslave you. Southerners, who went on to be Confederates, gave us a label, gave white people a label, poor white people, after 1854. A book written by George Fitzhugh, Sociology of Slavery. They didn't like poor Irish, and they didn't like poor Scottish, and they didn't like poor English. They labeled them mudsills, and it was time to start enslaving them as well. So that was one of the thoughts. So there's documentation that supports that that's what brought Lincoln out of retirement. So he was a congressman, he retired in 1849, 1854, after this book comes out, shocks everybody, then they decide, you know what, we're gonna have to start the Republican Party. So I'm saying all this because this is the environment that she was living in. Even though she couldn't read and write, and Frederick Douglass, this was it. Yeah, so that's the environment. So Harriet Tubman escaped from enslavement in 1849. She makes her way to Philadelphia. By 1851 December, she has 11 freedom seekers, and she makes her way to St. Catharines. From there on out, she calls it home. Why? She says, I wouldn't trust Uncle Sam with my people no longer. I brought them all clear off to Canada. And that's because of the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act. So many things were happening, the dynamics at that time, that caused her to come here. Otherwise, she would have stayed in her native land. So her most famous quote here from 1855, that's what she's saying, I'd rather be in my native land. So the number one dynamic is separation of families. Number two, the procreation of black women. Number three, the taskmaster's whip. Can anybody guess number four? Degrading. And it's a one word, degrading. When they called you out of your name and they called you the N-word, that was it. Yeah. Never come here by your name. It was always come here. That's what it was all the time. Degrading, very degrading. So we have Tubman here. It's 1851. We know she cannot read and write because that was illegal. So that's really number 5, the fifth dynamic. Keep them ignorant, no education. It was against the law. So we have Tubman here. She decides she's going to go back and forth, and she did. 1854, she brings her 3 brothers. And I'm going to talk more about that when we're downstairs. By 1857, she's bringing her elderly parents, Ben and Rit. And they're, at least in their 80s. She comes up with a contraption. She finds an old horse. She comes up with a contraption where she's making a seat, 2 wheels, an axle for them to rest their feet on to get them out of Maryland. And then they arrive here in St. Catharines. So Tubman stays here until early January 1862, and that's when she goes to Massachusetts and she meets Governor Andrew, and she agrees to take part in the Civil War for the Union Army. But there is one thing here that I want to mention that York University discovered in about 10 years ago now. Yeah, around 2011. Researcher and historian Hilary Dawson was going through some of the records here, the City Council records here in St. Catharines. And what's amazing is Harriet Tubman found a child on the street here in December 1820. And she went before the mayor and city council and asked for money to help her with this orphaned child. And they gave her $1 a week for 4 weeks. The child's gender has never been identified. So she had this little child with her that she was taking care of. So that was December. March of the next year, her brother goes before council. He has a little child, a boy, and they give him $1 a week for 10 weeks. So everybody else is thinking, well, Tubman must have had a little girl because women were discriminated against unbelievably back then. But that's one of the most bizarre things about Harriet Tubman, finding the child on the street. So what we know that she did, Franklin Sanborn, her first biographer, a white male from Concord, Massachusetts, and a member of John Brown's Secret Six, said that when she first arrived in December 1851, she worked in the timber forest, chopping down wood. We do know that she operated a boarding house. That's where Ace Alignment's parking lot is, where she housed freedom seekers, and she housed her elderly parents. We do know that St. Catharines was a major tourist area. So from her narrative in Cape May, New Jersey, as well as Philadelphia, she worked in the hotels and she worked as a domestic. There's nothing to say that she did not do that here during the tourism season because employment was plentiful. But we just don't have the documentation to support that. So it's not like she couldn't do anything here, but we do know that she operated the boarding house, and that boarding house is where she met John Brown as well. Any questions about Tubman? We're going to talk more about her downstairs. Then we're just going to now, the third person, Zion Baptist Church. Salem Chapel wasn't the only black church in the city of St. Catharines. So we had Zion Baptist Church as well. That was about 50 meters away. So McGeorge's parking lot, 2 lots over, was where Zion Baptist Church was. It was demolished in 1958. So Zion Baptist Church began as a Baptist society in 1838. A gentleman by the name of Elder Washington Christian, who was enslaved in Kentucky, moved to New York City, became an ordained elder, then moved to Toronto, was here, and he decided that he was going to form a Baptist society. So that was 1838, and then they eventually purchased property from William Hamilton Merritt to construct Zion Baptist Church. So the doors opened there in 1844. And Zion Baptist Church between 1844 to 1860 went through 4 ministers. So there was a gentleman by the name of Anthony Burns who was living in Virginia. He escaped from enslavement under the 1854 Fugitive Slave Act. So May 1854, he made his way to Boston. So he's in Boston, and he makes the fatal mistake of acknowledging his enslaver, who's in hot pursuit of him. Now he's arrested, and he's taken to the courthouse. Most of the courthouses doubled as jails at the time as well. So as luck would have it, Boston's leading white male abolitionist and attorney, Henry Dana, was there. And he said, Anthony Burns, I'll defend you. So in the northern cities, if a black person was apprehended, the bells would ring, the Liberty Bells. People in the community knew what that meant. Everybody gather together, and let's try to prevent this arrest by any means necessary. If we have to fight you and kill you, that's how it's going to go down. Boston was a hub of radical abolitionists, and that's exactly what they did. Killed 2 people after they stormed the courthouse, but they could not free Anthony Burns. We all know what breaking news is, right? And we're all familiar with Black Lives Matter. So visualize Black Lives Matter today. Half the people marching and protesting are white. That's how Boston was in 1854. Radical abolitionists. So, 10 days of rioting. It cost the U.S. government $40,000. 22 armed militiamen, law enforcement men, to march him from the Boston courthouse to the harbor, to put him on a ship, to sail him back and return him to slavery in Virginia. His friends from Boston didn't forget about him. They tried to purchase his freedom. But Charles Settle said, no, we're not going to let you buy Anthony Burns. He was just being bitter, a mean man. But he got tired of the harassment, so he sold Burns to a North Carolina enslaver. So his friends in Boston decided, you know what? We'll come up with a plan. So they devised a trick. They got a white northern male to pretend he was a white southerner to go purchase Anthony Burns and purchase him for $1,200 worth of abolitionist gold. So now Burns is free. He's back in Boston, goes to New York City, P.T. Barnum at Bailey Circus, everybody's familiar with that. The greatest show on earth, right? It closed down. But P.T. Barnum owned the New York American Museum. And he said to Anthony Burns, I'll give you $100 a week to tell your story on the lecture circuit. And Anthony Burns said, I'm not going to do that. He said he's not going to be paraded around like a monkey, because he'd have to tell his story on the lecture circuit next to the bearded lady, Tom Thumb, who was only 18 inches tall, Siamese twins, all the carnival freak show people. And Burns said, no, I'm not having that. So a white woman, a Quaker woman, offered to pay his theology studies at Oberlin College in Ohio. Oberlin College was the only interracial college in the country at the time. So Burns took up that offer. So he studied there for a few years. Then he moved on, after he received his degree, he moved on to Indiana. So once white people there got wind of who he was, like, this is Anthony Burns. No, you're getting out of our town, because everybody recalled the breaking news. That was the largest abolitionist revolt in U.S. history. 50,000 people on the streets of Boston going nuts over this one man. So they told Burns to get out. There was a vacancy here in St. Catharines. So he made his way here in 1860, July 1860. The church was in financial ruin because of 2 previous ministers taking money out of the coffers when they shouldn't be. One was caught as being a drunkard on the street. That was Reverend John Anderson. And the trustees wouldn't have none of that, so they put the ministers out. You can't rip us off, and you can't, behave like that on the streets of St. Catharines or anywhere if you're a man of the cloth. So they had a vacancy. Anthony Burns arrived. Within 2 years, he turns the dead around. He's a revered member of the community. But he's ill, and he dies at the age of 28. He's buried out at Victoria Lawn Cemetery. His marker was erected, his provincial marker, in 1964. It was the St. Catharines Lincoln and Historical Society that did that. 4 white males wanted to commemorate him. They went to Zion Baptist Church. The stewardess at the time was Clara Bell Williams, because they had no minister. They said to her, this is what we'd like to do. She was, of course, in favor of that. And they needed a minister to oversee the event, the ceremony for opening prayer. They had Reverend Francis from here participate in that event. So Anthony Burns' plaque is at the gates of Victoria Lawn Cemetery. So we're blessed here in St. Catharines for having 3 famous Black figures. Richard Pierpoint, we have the park named after him now, Harriet Tubman, as well as Anthony Burns. And I put them in that order because Pierpoint was first. We don't tell their story, just a little bit of it, because they tell their story. She eventually moved to Auburn, New York, and she died there. She lived there for 50 plus years. We don't tell their story because they tell their story. We tell her story as an Underground Railroad operative, Moses, when she was coming here back and forth to St. Catharines. So it starts off with in 1849. She's in Maryland, she's escaping with 2 brothers. They forced her to turn back because, again, the #1 dynamic of slavery. Your enslaver could have separated your family, but it was very, very hard to leave your family. Not everybody had the courage to do that, and you see that by the numbers. So people say anywhere from 20,000 to 100,000 people escaped from 1790 to 1861. Not everybody was willing to do that. Some people would rather stay behind and stay with their loved ones, if they could. So Harriet Tubman's brothers caused her to turn back. Then she learned that she was going to be sold again, and she said, if she's going to be separated from her families for the remainder of her life, it's going to be on her terms. So she left and went to Philadelphia. So pictures like this, they're copies of tin plates. You'll see them all along the bottom ledge, some of them. They're of unknown people that were living in St. Catharines. These are pictures from the Rick Bell collection that's housed at Brock University. So these are unknown figures. Tin plates were developed in 1856. So then here's information about the Fugitive Slave Law, the Fugitive Slave Bill that caused Harriet Tubman to move to St. Catharines. This is about her first rescue, her niece Keziah Jolie Boley. So they were about 6 years apart. She learned that her niece was going to be sold on the Cambridge auction block. They devised a plan. Tubman went down to Maryland, and with Keziah's free Black husband, they rescued her and her 2 children and brought them to Philadelphia. December 18th, did everybody see the Harriet Tubman movie? Okay, so the movie timeline was off. A lot of the information that took place in the movie happened after the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act passed. For example, the rescue of her 3 brothers. That happened in 1854, but the movie placed it before 1850. So that's Hollywood sensationalism. The other thing they did in the movie, because you know the movie was an epic flop in Black America, it tanked. It was done. Nobody liked it. White America, if you're a history buff, it tanked. Flopped. Can anybody guess why? The Black Bounty Hunter. Revisionist history. There was no truth to that whatsoever. So for the younger generation and people that weren't involved in history, they made it appear as though not only were Black people running away, Black people were the slave catchers too. That never happened. If you research the American anti-slavery tracts between 1831 and 1861, there is not one Black bounty hunter documented. They're all white. Why Hollywood did that? Sensationalism. But those that were at the round table, there were Black folks there too. So they're just as much to blame. The director, the financier, who was the producer, and the scriptwriter. That movie tanked, and everybody's very upset that that would happen to such an iconic figure. A horrible movie. But PBS is doing a documentary of Tubman. It'll be out in October, as well as one about Frederick Douglass. So we've got the rescue mission. December of her niece, December 1851, she arrives with 11 freedom seekers. Frederick Douglass was the station manager in Rochester, New York. He said the highest number he ever sheltered in his home was 11, and that was in the early 1850s. So most likely it was Harriet Tubman because she guided 11 through the Eastern Line. This is a depiction of Harriet Tubman crossing Suspension Bridge. This is information about her rescues between 1851 and 1855. So those that she rescued or guided directly, and those that she gave instructions to. These are images of St. Catharines when Harriet Tubman was here. So this is the St. Paul Street Methodist Church, which is now Silver Spire. And of course, another image of St. Paul Street, and then the courthouse, which also doubled as the jail. So this is William Hamilton Merritt. I mentioned him upstairs, Niagara's leading white male abolitionist, father of transportation. He built the Welland Canal, the first one, as well as the Suspension Bridge, president on the Canadian side, and he was a member of Parliament. Harriet Tubman goes back in December 1854, and she rescues her brothers. Here's one of her brothers, William Henry Stewart. This picture was taken of him here in St. Catharines. So he was one of the brothers that caused her to turn back. This is a picture of Mary Ann Shadd Carey. She was a free black, born in Delaware, and then she eventually moved to Ontario, so the Windsor area, with family in North Buxton after the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act passed. The first female publisher in North America. She was publisher and editor of the Provincial Freeman. She visited St. Catharines multiple times because her sister, Amelia Cisco Shadd, was living here in St. Catharines, free black of course, but Amelia was married to David T. Williamson, who had escaped from Virginia, extremely talented. He owned a jewelry shop here in St. Catharines. As a publisher, she would rail against slavery and the living conditions in the black communities, or the broader communities in Canada. So in St. Catharines, she railed against the school board system. Segregated schools. We're getting B grade and C grade teachers for the children, the colored youth. But she also said St. Catharines was riddled with Negrophobia. Gentlemen like him, William Hamilton Merritt, even though they were staunch abolitionists and Canada was the gateway to freedom, St. Catharines was a tourist town. What was driving the economy? Tourism. Between April and November, tour season. Who was coming? Southerners. Just like in the North. Anti-slavery sympathizers, white males, staunch abolitionists in Boston and everywhere, but who's driving the economy? Southerners. What's king? Cotton. So, in one hand, I need money to live, but at the other hand, I don't like what you do and it's wrong. So that's what was happening. She railed against that, Mary Ann Shadd, but not just here in St. Catharines, everywhere. But she was one of the truthful ones. This is Samuel Gridley Howe. He was also a writer for the Provincial Freeman, but he was also an agent for the Anti-Slavery Society of Canada. So, I want to back up to here. Frederick Douglass visits in 1852. Militia Day riot. Black men parading in military uniforms, redcoats, British. Young white males didn't like black men marching in British uniform, so they're pelting them with rocks. Here, black people could vote, we could buy property, we could do whatever. We had the same livelihoods as white folks had, the same laws applied. They wanted justice for this disruption for the parade. They weren't getting it, so they decided to go to Stenson's Taverns and they started the melee. Fight breaks out, white males are very upset. They enlist the fire brigade. The fire brigade comes down here and sets the North Street houses on fire. 1 year later, white males like William Hamilton Merritt decide, like town council decided, to reimburse the black community and rebuild the neighborhood. So that's what happened. He's here and he's writing for the Toronto Globe, and he's saying it's the most darn Yankee town in all of the Dominion because of what they had done to the black community. So it was individuals like him who pretty much forced their hand, although many were sympathetic and were already in favor of rebuilding the community. So 1854, we end up with a boycott. So now black people are employed as laborers, hospitality industry, omnibus drivers, stagecoach drivers, waiters, domestics, gardeners. Men like William Hamilton Merritt are now divided. Southerners don't want black people riding in the same stagecoach as them. So it's a mess. So then in the hotel industry, they decide, you know what, we're gonna have to stop black people from riding in the stagecoaches so that we're appeasing the white Southerners and we keep the dollars flowing. Well, a boycott takes place. And it's at the second church. So the boycott occurred before this church was built, and the meeting occurred in the second church. And they said, you know what, we're gonna protest. And they shut down for a month. And it caused them to open up the stagecoaches to black people as well. So somebody asked me a question upstairs, the population. So 1855, 8,000 people, 800 are of African descent, 700 are freedom seekers, so runaway slaves. So when it was tour season, the population doubled. So we'd have 6,000 in the area, but 6,000 visitors as well. And I'm going to talk more about the tourism industry. This is Benjamin Drew. He wrote the book, The North Side View of Slavery, and I mentioned Tubman's narrative upstairs. So he interviewed people throughout Canada West, and this is what he said about St. Catharines. Now, let me just mention, these displays were up in January, they were down. Then when the region decided that they were going to dig on the opposite side of the street to put the fiber cables in, rather than put up new displays, we just put the old ones back up. So some of them look pretty shabby, and that's why. So, Black Lives Matter again. So, and we call it the George Floyd effect. So when in 2020, when you've seen them on TV, and you've seen the Confederate Mall in Virginia, and the big monument of Robert E. Lee, and you had images projected on that monument because they wanted it removed, the majority of the time it was Tubman on that image, and you can go on YouTube and see it. And this was the quote, "I think slavery is the next thing to hell." And that comes from her St. Catharines narrative. So Benjamin Drew published the book, The North Side View of Slavery, in 1856. He interviewed Tubman in 1855. The reason he published was to counter a book that was called The South Side View of Slavery. So Harriet Tubman saying she grew up like a neglected weed, ignorant of liberty, having no experience of it. And so a lot of what people pick apart from her narrative and her famous quotes come from what she said right here in St. Catharines. And she said she'd rather be in her native land. So we have Frederick Douglass as the station manager in Rochester, New York. And then we have William Still, who was the station manager in Philadelphia, another colleague of Harriet Tubman's. So what he did was he captured freedom seeker narratives as they passed through his station in Philadelphia. And then in 1872, he published a book called The Underground Railroad. It's almost 1,000 pages, and that contains the majority of narratives. If you can find an ancestor in this book that escaped from enslavement, you're somebody. You're a hero. You've got documentation. And I say that because at least you know. Whereas other people of African descent, no documentation, you don't know. You watch Henry Louis Gates, Finding Your Roots. See how hard it is for black people to trace their ancestry? Because it's a dead trail. And I mean, it's a miracle. If we can go beyond 1840, whoa, you are somebody. Whereas half the white people in this room, I mean, I sit there and listen to white people all the time. One lady says, "Oh yes, I can go back to King Louis, blah, 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 and, Queen Anne and all this." I wish. And then I have people look at me like, "How come you can't?" We're not going to go there. We'll just leave it at that. But we can't. So that's why you hear Henry Louis Gates say that. So this, for black folks, especially if your ancestry is American, the Miracle Book. Second would be Drew, and then Samuel Gridley Howells, because the documentation's not there. Census records before 1860, it would just be black male, enslaved, in a dash. How are you supposed to find? You got to know who the slaveholder was first, you know what I mean? And then try to identify and put it through age. But that's what happened. So more rescues between 1856 and 57. And then Tubman saying, I've seen hundreds of escaped slaves, but never saw one who was willing to go back and be a slave. And that's because Southerners would always say, enslaved people are happy and content. No. So that's Tubman countering that. Suspension Bridge. So where Harriet Tubman crossed before 1855, before this bridge was constructed by William Hamilton Merritt, we don't know. So we do know that there were crossing points from Youngstown, New York, to Niagara-on-the-Lake. So we're, what was it called? The Red Barracks or Navy Hall. Then from Queenston, Lewiston, so Lewiston, New York, to Queenston. Ferry crossings there. And then, of course, Buffalo and Black Rock across to Fort Erie. So upper and lower, and then in 1855, it became the Suspension Bridge. One documented account of her crossing into Canada, and it's the rescue of Josiah Bailey, November 1856. There's interpretive markers on the Niagara Parkway at the Whitewater Walk, close to the lower bridge. So Joe Bailey was enslaved. He was owned by his enslaver who put him out to labor, so he hired him out. He was with a gentleman who had hired him out for 6 years, and then the man decided to purchase Joe Bailey. The day the sale was complete, Joe Bailey received his first beating, and he wanted to know why, and the enslaver said, you have to understand who's in control, who owns you. I own you. So Joe Bailey got in a boat and rowed himself to Harriet Tubman's dad's place in Madison Stick. His name was, they called him Old Ben, but Benjamin Ross Sr. And he said, the next time Moses comes, you let her know that I'm ready to go. 3 weeks later, she appears. She lets them know the rendezvous point. Joe Bailey arrives, his brother William Bailey, as well as Peter Pennington. And here's Peter Pennington's reward, $800. Joe Bailey's reward was, William Bailey's reward was $300. Joe Bailey's was $1,500 in state. So, normally it took a day or two to get out of Maryland to get to Delaware. 2 weeks. They're hiding in potato holes. They're hiding in barns, corn cobs, swamps, marshes, you name it. They had no idea. They thought that was how the Underground Railroad worked, and they were happy. And Harriet Tubman, you know, people communicating with her, you were in hot pursuit because they wanted Joe Bailey. The reward was phenomenal. Unheard of. So, you know, they were being tracked right to the border, which is where the Underground Railroad stopped. They make it to Baltimore, then they make it to Delaware. Delaware, while Thomas Garrett separates them, they're all separated until they make it to Philadelphia. William Still just captures a few sentences, sends them off to New York City. They get to New York City, the Anti-Slavery Society, and there it's either Oliver Johnson or Sidney Howard Gay, who says, you must be Joe Bailey, and shows him the reward picture. He knows it's him because there's a scar on the left side of his face. So of course the man collapses. What's going on? I thought everything was great. He wanted to turn back. Harriet Tubman, just like everybody on the walls, communicated with God on a daily basis, loved the Lord, everybody did, but who didn't carry a pistol or a machete or, you know, cut your head off in a minute because that was the time. Go on or die. A dead person tells no tales. Joe Bailey was not turning back, because if he did, he's getting his beating until he turns in everybody. So, all he wanted to know was what was the distance, because he can't go back. He knows they're going to get him there, and he's now afraid of all the abolitionists who are telling him, we're going to kill you before they do. You ain't going back. So now he's got his head in his hands. He's on the train. He's got to make it 300 miles to Suspension Bridge. He crosses the bridge, because the reward's now $2,000 for him. He crosses the bridge, and Tubman's trying to tell him. So now they're in the center of the bridge. Get up and look at the falls, Joe, and he won't. Get up, you old fool, and look at the falls. You're now safe. You're on British soil. He didn't. He waited until they got to Niagara Falls, Ontario, and the conductor told him, you're safe, you're in freedom land now. Then he jumps off the train, rubs dirt all over him, praises God, then hops back on. But Tubman's killing herself laughing in the narrative because all he had to do was look at the falls. So after, come and look at this picture, and you can see the falls. And this picture is about circa 1860. So just a couple of years afterwards. When they captured John Brown, they found out that Harriet Tubman was one of his co-conspirators, as well as others like Frederick Douglass. So Tubman ended up back in St. Catharines. She was starting to relocate to Auburn, New York, but then that didn't work, so she ended up back here. William Howard Day, they found out that he actually printed John Brown's provisional constitution, the new government that he was going to introduce once he overtook the U.S. government here in St. Catharines. Unbelievable. So imagine all the rioting and craziness taking place in St. Catharines when this guy is captured. So I'm going to say this. Everybody's familiar with the Nat Turner insurrection. Nat Turner revolt. So that was 1831. Before that, Denmark, BC in 1822 in South Carolina. So, of course, they were going on a killing spree to stop slavery, so they were shooting Southerners. Nat Turner did the same thing in Virginia. White people had a little bit of fear. So what they did then was they just enforced more stricter laws, monitoring black people, keeping them down, doing other horrific things. So they said, you know, they could asleep with their gun on their nightstand when black people were revolting. But when John Brown did it with other white males, oh no, now you're going to stay awake. One eye's going to be open, somebody's going to be awake at night, and we're going to sleep with our pistol on our chest, if we sleep at all, because now it was a new dynamic. Now, northern white people want to overthrow slavery, which was unheard of until John Brown came. So this is the catalyst that started the Civil War. Prior to him, Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. How many people have read that? That's an amazing book. Think back to it. Eliza, jumping the ice blocks on the Ohio, and the description of her and her kids. So again, miscegenation played a big part in the overthrow of the Civil War. William Wells Brown, black abolitionist. This is him describing the settlement in 1860, but it was published in 1861. Here, that top one there is when Harriet Tubman formed the Fugitive Aid Society here in St. Catharines. So the first documented account is in the middle of 1861. This is a picture of the Underground Railroad, which had many branches. This is Frederick Douglass's quote right here. So the Underground Railroad had many branches, starting in Baltimore, then Wilmington, Delaware, then Philadelphia, New York City, Albany, New York, Syracuse, New York, then Rochester, then crossing at Suspension Bridge, and then ending up here in St. Catharines. Frederick Douglass legitimized this town. The Underground Railroad stopped at the border. Once you crossed into Canada, you were free on British soil after 1793, thanks to Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe, because the act that was passed in 1793 limited the importation of slavery. So once a black person landed here, they were free. Slavery was abolished throughout Canada, well, the British colonies, August 1st, 1834. Douglass said that we were a final stop on the Underground Railroad terminus. No other town in Canada West can say that. Douglass said it for us, and we thank him for it. John Gooseberry from St. Catharines enlisted into the Civil War, Harriet Tubman in the Civil War, and then some of her colleagues. On the other side, that's the newest picture of Harriet Tubman, her obit that was written in the Toronto Globe, and then the top white sheet are her 5 descendants that were still here in St. Catharines, but one was in Cayuga, Haldimand County, when she passed away in 1913. Any questions? That's it. Thank you for coming. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this guided tour in this episode. There is so much history and so much knowledge that could potentially be lost if these stories aren't told. A lot of people are not aware of some of the connections that people have between Canada and the US when it comes to Black history. We celebrate Black History Month in the month of February in both the United States and Canada, and oftentimes the stories we hear are usually only the stories from the US side. And this is not to negate important stories told from the United States, because all of those stories are very important. We have equally significant stories that are missing from Canada that need to be told as well. And I'm so glad to have brought you this episode today so that you can learn more about the connection of Black people in Canada to the US, to Africa, to the world. There's so much knowledge, so much sharing. If you have any comments, if you have anything that you want to share, please put them in the comments. And if you like this episode, don't forget to hit the like button, and don't forget to share. Don't forget to subscribe so you can see more stories on my channel from Africa and the African diaspora. Thanks for watching.